The rain had not stopped since morning. It fell in a gray, relentless sheet against the many windows of Blackwood Manor, each drop a tiny hammer against the glass, measuring out the seconds of a long and silent grief. The house itself seemed to be weeping, its stone facade darkened to the color of a bruise, its gardens surrendering to the encroaching wilderness of wet, tangled weeds. Inside, the air was cold, not merely with the chill of late autumn, but with a deeper, more permanent cold that emanated from the shuttered rooms and dust-sheeted furniture. It was the cold of a house that had forgotten its purpose. Alara Vance felt the cold in her bones. It was a familiar sensation, a companion she had known through years of dependence on the strained charity of distant relations. She stood in the center of the grand entrance hall, a small, still figure in a traveling cloak of indeterminate gray, her presence doing little to disturb the profound stillness of the space. High above, a chandelier, shrouded in muslin like a captured ghost, failed to catch any light. The marble floor, a chessboard of black and white, was filmed with a fine layer of dust that softened its edges and muted its grandeur. The silence was so complete that she could hear the whisper of her own breath. She had been brought here under duress, the last resort of a family tree that had shed all its more prosperous branches. Her final protector, a great aunt with a dwindling pension and a sharp tongue, had passed a month prior, leaving Alara with a single trunk, a handful of shillings, and a letter of introduction to the Duke of Blackwood. A cousin so many times removed, the connection was practically theoretical. The letter had been answered not by the Duke himself, but by his sister, Lady Beatrice, whose own reply was as thin and sharp as the paper it was written on. Lady Beatrice now descended the grand staircase, her movements crisp and impatient, the rustle of her black silk dress the only sound to rival the rain. She was a woman carved from ice, handsome but severe, her face a mask of polite disdain. She did not offer a hand or a word of welcome. Her eyes swept over Alara, cataloging the worn fabric of her cloak, the scuffed toes of her boots, the plainness of her face, and found her utterly, predictably wanting. "Miss Vance," she began, her voice as devoid of warmth as the hall itself. "My brother, the Duke, is not receiving visitors. His grief, you understand." Alara understood grief. She understood its power to hollow out a person, to shutter the windows of a soul. She merely inclined her head, a gesture of quiet acknowledgement that asked for nothing. "You may, of course, remain." "For a time," Lady Beatrice continued, the concession sounding more like a sentence. "We are not so uncharitable as to turn away family, however distant." She gestured vaguely towards a grim-faced housekeeper who had materialized from the shadows. "Mrs. Gable will show you to your room." The journey to the room was a tour of neglect. They passed through galleries where the portraits of long-dead ancestors stared out from behind a veil of grime, their painted eyes seeming to follow with weary disapproval. They traversed corridors where runners of once rich carpet were worn thin, their patterns erased by the passage of time and forgotten feet. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of gray light that penetrated the gloom, the only lively things in the entire manor. Finally, at the end of a long, narrow passage in the seldom-used north wing, Mrs. Gable stopped before a small, unassuming door. The air here was markedly colder, the stone walls leaching warmth from the body. The housekeeper opened the door onto a room that was little more than a cell. It contained a narrow bed with a thin mattress, a small washstand with a chipped basin, and a single straight-back chair. A tall, mullioned window looked out not onto the gardens, but onto a sheer stone wall of an adjacent turret, its surface slick with rain and green with moss. The view was one of perpetual shadow. "This will be yours," Mrs. Gable stated, her tone flat. There was no apology in it, but perhaps, Alara thought, a sliver of something that might have been pity, quickly suppressed. She left, without another word, the sound of her footsteps retreating down the hall until they were swallowed by the oppressive silence. Alara stepped inside and let her small trunk slide from her numb fingers to the bare floorboards. The sound echoed in the small space. He gave her the smallest room in the house to make her feel small. The thought came to her, clear and precise, not with anger, but with a strange, weary clarity. Lady Beatrice's intention was as plain as the damp spot blooming in the corner of the ceiling. This room was not an accommodation. It was a statement. It was meant to be a place of quiet humiliation, a daily reminder of her insignificance, her poverty, her utter dependence. She walked to the window and pressed her hand against the cold glass. She watched a single drop of rain trace a path down the pane, joining others, becoming a stream. It was meant to crush her spirit, to make her fold in on herself until she was as small and gray as her surroundings. It didn't work, because Alara Vance, in her quiet, unassuming way, was not made of things that could be diminished by the size of a room. Her world had long been an internal one, built of resilience and observation, and it was a world she carried with her. The room was cold, yes, it was small, but it was also a beginning. It was a space, however meager, that was hers to occupy. And in the vast, sleeping emptiness of Blackwood Manor, that felt like something. From a window in the west wing, a figure watched her arrival. Alistair, the Duke of Blackwood, had seen the carriage pull up the drive, had seen the small gray shape emerge and stand for a long moment, simply looking up at the house that had become his prison. He had watched her enter and be swallowed by its shadows. He did not know who she was, only that she was another obligation, another demand upon an emotional treasury that was long since bankrupt. He had retreated into the solitude of his study after his wife's death a year ago, leaving the running of the house, the world, to his sister. He wanted only to be left alone with the ghosts. He had heard Beatrice's clipped tones in the hall and had felt a familiar weariness. He knew her methods. He could picture the room she would have assigned this new arrival, some forgotten corner of the house, cold and unwelcoming. It was Beatrice's way of maintaining order, of keeping the world at a distance, just as he did, though her methods were active and cruel where his were passive and born of despair. He turned from the window, the image of the small, straight-backed figure in the rain lingering in his mind. He told himself it was of no consequence. He was wrong. The first few days, Alara did nothing but acclimate. She learned the rhythms of the house, the shuffling footsteps of the skeleton staff, the distant clang of a pot from the kitchens, the funereal chime of the grand clock in the hall that seemed to be marking the passage of not hours, but entire eras. Meals were brought to her room on a tray, simple fare, which she ate by the gray light of her window. She saw no one but the servant who delivered the food, and she spoke to no one. She was an island in a sea of silence. But Alara was not built for idleness. Her hands, which had always been busy, mending, darning, balancing ledgers for her great-aunt, felt strange and empty. On the fourth day, she began. She started with her own small room. She used a cloth from her trunk to wipe down every surface, removing the film of dust. She scrubbed the basin until the porcelain gleamed. She pulled the thin blanket taut on the bed, smoothing every wrinkle until it was a crisp, straight line. The room was still small, still cold, but it was now clean. It had a sense of order. From her room she expanded. The long, cold corridor outside her door was next. She found a broom and a dustpan in a forgotten utility closet. The rhythmic scrape and whisk of the bristles on the stone floor was a comforting sound, a sound of purpose. She worked her way down the hallway, slowly, methodically, leaving a path of clean stone in her wake. She found a tin of beeswax and a soft cloth, and she began to polish the wooden doors, the dull, thirsty wood drinking in the wax and rewarding her with a deep, soft luster. No one asked her to, no one thanked her. And most importantly, no one told her to stop. She was so insignificant, so thoroughly forgotten in her remote wing of the house, that her labors went entirely unnoticed. She was a ghost of a different sort, a spirit of quiet industry in a house haunted by inertia. One afternoon, exploring the deserted corridors, she came upon the library. The double doors were closed, but not locked. She pushed one open, the hinges groaning in protest. The room within was vast, 2 stories high, with towering shelves of books that disappeared into the upper gloom. A film of dust covered everything, thick and soft as velvet. The air was heavy with the scent of decaying paper and forgotten stories. But unlike the rest of the house, which felt dead, the library felt merely asleep. It was waiting. Alara felt a sense of reverence. This was a treasure house. She ran a finger along the spine of a leather-bound book, leaving a clean streak in the dust. For the first time since her arrival, she felt a flicker of something akin to joy. She began to explore, her footsteps silent on the thick carpet. In a small alcove, half hidden behind a tapestry, she found a desk, and on the desk, piled in chaotic stacks, were the estate ledgers. They were a disaster. Spines were broken, pages were loose, and the entries were a mess of hasty scrawls, blots of ink, and unexplained sums. It was clear that for a very long time, no one had been paying proper attention. Alara, who had kept her great-aunt's household accounts to the penny for a decade, felt an almost physical ache at the sight of such chaos. Order was, to her, a form of comfort, a way of making sense of the world. And here was a world that desperately needed to be made sense of. She pulled up a chair, took out a fresh cloth she had brought with her, and began to wipe the dust from the cover of the topmost ledger. She opened it. The work began. Alistair began to notice the changes. They were small things at first, almost subliminal. A brass handle on a door that caught the light where before it had been dull. The scent of lemon oil in a hallway he had not traversed in months. A runner in the west gallery that had been straightened and brushed. He dismissed them at first as tricks of the light, or perhaps a sudden, uncharacteristic burst of diligence from his aging staff. But the changes continued, small ripples of order spreading from some unseen epicenter. He was drawn from his study by a curiosity he had not felt in a year. He began to walk the halls of his own home, a stranger in a familiar land. He followed the trail of small, quiet improvements, a trail of care in a house that had been starved of it. It led him, eventually, to the north wing, a part of the manor he had completely forgotten existed. And then, one afternoon, it led him to the library. He had not set foot in the room since his wife's death. It had been her favorite place. He pushed the door open, expecting the same stagnant, dusty air of his memories. Instead, the air was clean. The dust was gone from the lower shelves, the books arranged in neat, orderly rows. The great mahogany tables had been polished to a deep, dark gleam. And at the small desk in the alcove, bent over a ledger, sat the gray figure he had seen from his window. Alara did not hear him enter. She was entirely absorbed in her task, a pen in one hand, her other finger tracing a line of figures. A stray beam of weak afternoon sun, having found its way through a newly cleaned window pane, illuminated her head, catching the faint glint of brown in her otherwise unremarkable hair. Her brow was furrowed in concentration. She was not making a grand gesture. She was simply doing a job that needed to be done. He stood there for a long time, just watching her. He saw the neat stacks of paper at her elbow, the methodical way she made notations in a small notebook of her own. He saw the competence, the quiet dedication. She was not trying to impress anyone. She was, he realized, simply herself. In a world of performance and artifice, a world that had exhausted him with its demands, her simple, unadorned purpose was as startling as a sudden burst of music in a silent room. He stepped back, retreating before she could notice him. He returned to his study, but the image of her stayed with him. The house was still quiet. The rain still fell. But something had shifted. A single, small light had been lit in the darkness, and he found himself, against his will, drawn towards it. The next day, he returned to the library. He did not go to her desk, but selected a book from a shelf and sat in one of the large leather armchairs, pretending to read. He wanted to observe, to understand this quiet force that was moving through his home. Alara, aware of his presence, did not falter. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod in his direction and returned to her work. The silence in the room was different now. It was not the empty silence of neglect, but a shared silence of two people occupying the same space, each engaged in their own world, yet aware of the other. This became their routine. He would come to the library in the afternoon, and they would share the quiet space. Sometimes he would watch her for an hour, the pages of his book unturned. He noted the efficiency of her movements, the way she never made a wasted gesture. He noted the small, thoughtful things she did, placing a slip of paper in a book to mark a broken spine, carefully taping a torn page. She was not just organizing, she was mending. One afternoon, he broke the silence. "That is my great-grandfather's ledger," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. Alara looked up, her expression calm. She did not seem startled or flustered by his address. "Yes, Your Grace, the accounts are fascinating. He was experimenting with crop rotation in the West Fields." Her response was not what he expected. He had anticipated deference, perhaps a hurried apology for taking such liberties. Instead, she had engaged with the substance of the work. He was considered something of a radical, Alistair found himself saying. He was ahead of his time, she corrected gently. This entry suggests that if the practice had been continued, the estate's yield would have increased by 20%. She pointed to a column of figures. The soil would have been much healthier as well. He rose from his chair and walked over to her desk, drawn in by her quiet confidence. He leaned over her shoulder to look at the page. He was close enough to smell the faint, clean scent of soap from her skin and the dry, papery scent of the old book. It was an unexpectedly pleasant combination. He saw her notation in the margin, a neat, clear hand that brought order even to the empty spaces. "You have a keen eye, Miss Vance." "I only see what is there, Your Grace." He stayed by the desk, asking her questions not about her, but about the work. He learned more about the history and management of his own estate in that single hour than he had in the 10 years since he had inherited the title. She spoke of finances and agriculture with a passion he had previously only ever associated with art or poetry. She was not just balancing books, she was reading the story of his family, of his land, in the language of numbers. And she understood the grammar perfectly. As he prepared to leave, he gestured to the pile of disordered ledgers yet to be tackled. "It is a formidable task." "Every large task is merely a series of small ones," she replied, her gaze returning to the page. "One simply has to start." Alistair left the library that day feeling a profound sense of dislocation. The grief that had been his constant companion for a year had not vanished, but for the first time it had been forced to make room for something else. It had been forced to make room for curiosity. It had been forced to make room for respect. Lady Beatrice returned from a 2-week visit to a neighboring county to find a house subtly changed. The air felt lighter, the gloom less pervasive. She noticed the polished brass and the clean runners immediately, and her lips thinned in disapproval. This was a disruption of the established order, an order built around her brother's static grief and her own unquestioned authority. Her displeasure sharpened when she found her brother not in his study, but in the library, a room he had sworn never to enter again. And seated at the desk, as if she belonged there, was the little gray mouse of a relation, Alara Vance. Beatrice paused in the doorway, taking in the scene. The shared, comfortable silence, the way her brother was looking not at his book, but at the woman. A cold knot of fury and something that felt dangerously like fear tightened in her stomach. "Alistair," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass, "I did not expect to find you here." Alistair looked up, his expression unreadable. "Beatrice, you've returned." Her gaze flickered to Alara, dismissing her entirely. "I find the house in a state of activity. Has Mrs. Gable suddenly been struck by an attack of conscience?" "Miss Vance has been good enough to bring some order to the library," Alistair said, his tone mild, but with an underlying firmness Beatrice had not heard in a long time. Beatrice favored Alara with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "How industrious of you, cousin. But you must not trouble yourself. We have staff for such things, however indolent they may be. You are here as our guest." The word guest was layered with implications, none of them pleasant. It meant, you are temporary, you are dependent, you do not belong. Alara simply met her gaze and inclined her head. "It is no trouble, Lady Beatrice." The battle lines had been drawn, though only Beatrice seemed to recognize it as a war. She saw Alara's quiet competence not as a gift to the household, but as a threat to her own position. She began a campaign of small skirmishes. A vase of fresh flowers Alara had arranged in the hall would be moved to a forgotten side table. A book Alara had carefully repaired would be found lying open on the floor, its spine broken anew. She would countermand orders Alara had given to the gardeners, who had, at Alara's quiet suggestion, begun the monumental task of reclaiming the gardens from the weeds. At dinner, which Alara was now obliged to attend, Beatrice's attacks became more direct. She would regale her brother with stories of their shared past, of his late wife, weaving a tapestry of memory designed to draw him back into the fold of his grief and away from the present. She would pepper her conversation with veiled insults aimed at Alara. "We had a Miss Finch staying with us last month," she might say, her bright, false gaze fixed on Alara. "A dear girl, but so ambitious. It is a terrible quality in a woman of no means. It makes them so grasping." Through it all, Alara remained serene. She did not rise to the bait. She ate her food, listened politely, and spoke only when spoken to, her answers always direct and thoughtful. Her composure seemed to infuriate Beatrice more than any angry retort could have. Alara was a calm, still pool, and Beatrice's cruelty was merely a stone dropped into it, the ripples spreading and then vanishing, leaving the surface undisturbed. Alistair watched these exchanges in silence, but his silence was no longer the vacant silence of grief. It was an observant, assessing silence. He saw his sister's manipulations, her casual cruelty, and he saw Alara's quiet, unyielding dignity. And he began to see his sister perhaps for the first time, not as his protector, but as his jailer. One evening in the library, the growing connection between them solidified. Alara was working on a particularly difficult ledger, one from the tenure of the previous estate manager, a man Beatrice had hired and who had been dismissed for incompetence a year before Alistair's wife had passed. The numbers refused to align, the columns a testament to either profound ineptitude or deliberate obfuscation. Alistair, sensing her frustration in the slight tension of her shoulders, came to stand behind her. "A problem?" "There are disbursements here," she said, her voice low with concentration. "To a supplier, a Mr. Sedgefield. The amounts are significant, but there are no corresponding invoices, no record of any goods received." He leaned closer, his hand resting on the back of her chair to steady himself. The unintentional contact sent a jolt through her, a warmth that spread from her shoulder all the way to her fingertips. She froze for a heartbeat, the numbers on the page blurring. His proximity was overwhelming, the scent of old books and wool, and something that was uniquely him filling her senses. He seemed to feel it too. He did not pull away immediately. For a long moment, they remained like that, suspended in a space where the only things that existed were the dusty ledger, the faint light of the lamp, and the shocking, profound awareness of each other. The air was thick with unspoken things. Then he straightened, clearing his throat. The moment was broken. "Mr. Sedgefield," he said, his voice a little strained, "I do not know the name." He reached for a different ledger from the shelf, a heavy, leather-bound volume. As he passed it to her, his fingers brushed against hers. It was the briefest of contacts, a fleeting warmth of skin on skin, but it was electric. It was an acknowledgement, a confession of the current that flowed between them in the quiet of that room. "Perhaps this will help," he said, his eyes meeting hers over the book. And in his gaze, she saw not the remote, grieving Duke, but a man, vulnerable and questioning. She took the ledger, her hand trembling slightly. "Thank you, Your Grace." The touch, that small, accidental point of contact, had changed everything. It had given form to the intangible connection that had been growing between them in the shared silence. It was a secret they now both held, a silent pact made in the dusty air of the library. It was a promise of something that neither of them yet dared to name. The room, which had been a sanctuary, now felt charged with a new and potent energy. The crisis, when it came, arrived in a cream-colored envelope with a stark, red wax seal. It was delivered to the Duke's study, and its contents sent a tremor through the foundations of Blackwood Manor. It was from Mr. Thorne, the principal holder of the estate's debts, a man whose patience, the letter made abundantly clear, had finally run out. He was calling in the loans. The letter spoke of foreclosure, of public auction, of the utter ruin of a ducal line that had stood for 500 years. Alistair read the letter twice, the words blurring into a meaningless jumble of financial threats. The lethargy that had held him captive for a year was burned away by a surge of cold panic. He had allowed this to happen. Wrapped in his own sorrow, he had abdicated his duty, trusted his sister, and let his ancestral home slide towards the abyss. Beatrice, when shown the letter, reacted with predictable hysteria. She blamed the crops, the tenants, the late steward, her brother's reclusiveness, everything and everyone but herself. Her panic was that of a captain who had run her own ship aground and was now screaming at the tide. "Thorne is a vulture," she cried, pacing the study. "He has always wanted to see us humbled. We must appeal to our friends, to the family." Alistair knew their friends would offer condolences, but not cash. He felt the walls of his study closing in on him. Despair, a familiar old friend, came to sit in the chair opposite him. And then he thought of the library. He thought of the quiet, methodical woman who saw not just chaos, but the patterns within it. He found her exactly where he knew she would be, a single lamp casting a warm circle of light around her in the growing dusk. She looked up as he entered, and she must have seen the desperation on his face, because her own expression shifted from one of calm concentration to one of deep, quiet concern. He did not speak. He simply placed Mr. Thorne's letter on the desk in front of her. She read it slowly, her face impassive. When she finished, she looked not at him, but at the neat stack of notebooks at her elbow, the fruits of her weeks of silent labor. "It is serious," she said, her voice even. "But it may not be hopeless." This was the moment of revelation. She did not offer platitudes or assign blame. She offered possibility. She stood and retrieved a specific ledger, the one she had been working on when he had touched her chair. She opened it alongside one of her own notebooks. "Lady Beatrice dismissed the previous steward, Mr. Finch, for incompetence," she began, her finger tracing a line of spidery script. "But the real incompetence, I believe, began when she took over the accounts herself. Quietly, clearly, and without a trace of malice, Alara laid out the truth of Blackwood Manor. She showed him the hidden debts, the extravagant personal expenditures his sister had disguised as household costs, gowns, jewels, trips to the city. She showed him the payments to the non-existent Mr. Sedgefield, which corresponded exactly with funds withdrawn by Beatrice for unforeseen expenses. It was not grand theft, but a slow, steady bleed, the work of a woman who felt entitled to the wealth she managed and was utterly careless with it. This was the first part of the revelation, the extent of his sister's selfish mismanagement. But there was a second, more crucial part. Alara then opened another notebook. In it, she had not recorded debt, but potential. She had walked the estate, spoken to the tenant farmers, consulted old maps she had found in the library. She pointed to a section of forest. This timber is overmature. If selectively harvested, it would fetch a high price and allow for new growth. She turned a page. The east pastures are fallow. My great-grandfather's notes suggest they are perfect for grazing sheep. The wool market is very strong at present. She outlined a dozen such opportunities, small, practical, and achievable. She had created a plan, a roadmap back from the brink. Alistair stared at the pages, at her neat, precise handwriting. She had done more than balance his books. She had learned his home, understood its strengths and weaknesses, and she had charted a course for its future. She had done this while living in the smallest, coldest room, while being treated with contempt and condescension without ever being asked, and without any expectation of reward. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw the full measure of her character. He saw integrity so profound it was like a force of nature. He saw a brilliance that was quiet and practical, but no less dazzling for it. He saw the woman who was saving him, and he felt a wave of emotion so powerful it almost brought him to his knees, a mixture of shame for his own blindness and a deep, burgeoning awe. This was Alara's test. She held in her hands the proof of his sister's deceit. She could have presented it as a weapon, a tool for revenge against the woman who had tried to make her feel small. Instead, she presented it as a solution. Mr. Thorne is a businessman, she said. If we can present him with a credible plan for repayment, one that shows the estate is not a dying enterprise but a viable one, he may be persuaded to extend the terms. She offered him a path that could save not only the estate, but also the family name from public scandal. He felt a sudden, fierce surge of protectiveness towards her. He had allowed his sister to humiliate this woman, to try and crush this remarkable spirit. The thought filled him with a cold rage. "I will arrange a dinner," he said, his voice hard. "Mr. Thorne will attend. So will my sister, and so will you, Miss Vance. You will sit at my right hand, and you will be the one to present the plan." The dinner was a stage set for a final confrontation. The dining room, rarely used, had been aired and cleaned. The long mahogany table was polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the flickering light of a dozen candles. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Mr. Thorne, a portly man with shrewd, watchful eyes, sat on Alistair's left. Beatrice, dressed in defiant velvet, sat opposite her brother, her face a pale, tight mask of fury. And to Alistair's right sat Alara. She wore her only good dress, a simple gown of dark blue wool, and she looked small and utterly out of place amongst the heavy silver and glittering crystal. But there was a stillness about her, a core of unshakable calm. The first part of the meal was excruciating. Beatrice attempted to dominate the conversation with brittle, glittering chatter, trying to charm Mr. Thorne and pointedly ignoring Alara. Thorne, for his part, was impassive, his gaze moving between the Duke, his sister, and the silent woman beside him. After the main course was cleared, Alistair set down his wine glass. The small sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Mr. Thorne," he began, his voice clear and commanding, "you are here because you believe, with good reason, that this estate is no longer a sound investment. You believe we are bankrupt, not just in funds, but in vision. He paused, his eyes sweeping the table. For the past year you have been correct. I have been absent. I entrusted the management of my affairs to my sister. He looked directly at Beatrice, whose face had gone rigid. That was a mistake. Before Beatrice could formulate a reply, he turned to Alara. However, the situation has changed. Miss Vance has been conducting a thorough review of the estate's assets and liabilities. She has discovered certain irregularities, but more importantly, she has discovered its potential. His voice softened as he looked at her, a note of profound respect entering his tone. Miss Vance, would you be so good as to share your findings with Mr. Thorne? This was the moment of public humiliation for Beatrice. Her authority, her very presence, had been utterly negated. Her brother had publicly declared his trust in this penniless relation over her. As Alara began to speak, her voice low but clear, laying out her meticulous plan with quiet confidence, Beatrice's composure finally shattered. "This is an outrage," she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "Alistair, have you lost your mind? You would listen to this nobody? A charity case, a little brown mouse who has burrowed her way into your confidence by preying on your grief. She is an ambitious, conniving upstart who has been plotting to usurp my position from the moment she arrived." Her voice rose, becoming shrill. "She has bewitched you with her false humility. Can't you see it? She wants the title, the money, everything that should be mine." The room fell into a shocked silence. Mr. Thorne stared, his fork halfway to his mouth. The servants flattened themselves against the walls. Alara had stopped speaking, her face pale, but her eyes fixed on Beatrice, not with fear, but with a kind of sad pity. Alistair rose slowly from his chair. He did not look at his sister. He looked at Alara. He reached out and placed his hand over hers where it rested on the table, a deliberate public gesture of alliance and affection. Then he turned his gaze, cold as iron, upon his sister. This was his definitive action, his public defense. "You are wrong, Beatrice," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "She wants nothing. That is why she will now have everything." He let that sink in, the silence stretching until it was thin and humming. Miss Vance came to this house with nothing and was given nothing. She was given the smallest room, the coldest welcome. She was treated not as family, but as a burden. And in return for this cruelty, she has given us her brilliance, her integrity, and her tireless effort. She has worked to save this house while you have worked only to adorn yourself. She has shown more honor and loyalty in 2 months than you have shown in your entire life. He took a breath, his grip tightening on Alara's hand. "You speak of ambition. Let me tell you of Miss Vance's ambition. It is to see order where there is chaos, to see things mended, not broken, to see potential fulfilled. These are not the ambitions of an upstart. They are the ambitions of a leader. They are the ambitions of a duchess." The final word fell into the silence with the weight of a thrown gauntlet. Beatrice stared, her mouth slightly agape, her face a mask of disbelief and horror. Mr. Thorne's eyebrows had risen into his hairline. "From this day forward," Alistair continued, his voice resonating with the full authority of his title, "Miss Alara Vance is the sole and uncontested steward of the Blackwood estate. Her word is my word, her authority is my authority, and I will hear not one more word against her. Is that understood?" He looked from his sister to the servants to Mr. Thorne, his challenge absolute. Beatrice crumpled. All the fight went out of her, replaced by a sallow, bitter defeat. She pushed her chair back, her movements jerky and uncoordinated, and fled the room without another word. The antagonist, exposed and stripped of her power, had been vanquished not by a shout, but by the quiet, unassailable truth. Mr. Thorne cleared his throat, a shrewd, calculating look replacing his surprise. He looked at Alara's neat columns of figures, at her sensible projections. He looked at the Duke, who now stood foursquare behind her, a guardian and a partner. He saw not ruin, but a formidable team. A slow smile spread across his face. "Your Grace," he said, raising his glass, "to the new management. I believe we have much to discuss." The crisis was over. Later that night, after Mr. Thorne had departed, his mind full of timber yields and wool prices, a new and profitable agreement all but finalized, Alistair went in search of Alara. He did not find her in the library or the study, the new centers of her power. He found her where it had all begun. He found her in the small, cold room in the north wing. She was standing by the window, looking out at the moss-covered stone of the turret, just as she must have done on her first day. The room was unchanged, the narrow bed, the single chair. It was a stark reminder of how she had been received, of the life he had intended for her. The sight of her there, in that cell, filled him with a profound and humbling shame. She turned as he entered, her expression unreadable in the moonlight filtering through the window. "The room is cold," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I am sorry for this, for everything." "It is just a room, Your Grace," she replied softly. "It kept the rain out." "My name is Alistair," he said, stepping closer, "and I would be honored if you would use it." He stopped a few feet from her, wanting to close the distance but feeling he had not yet earned the right. "What I said at dinner, it was not for Thorne's benefit, or my sister's. It was the truth, all of it." He looked around the small, bare space. "My sister gave you this room to make you feel small, to remind you of your place. She believed that a person's worth was measured by the space they command. She was wrong." He took another step, his eyes locked on hers. "Your worth is immeasurable, Alara. It is not in a title or a room, but in here." He touched his own chest over his heart. "You came into this house, a house that was as cold and empty as I was, and you began to mend it. You polished and ordered and cared for it, not because you were told to, but because it is who you are. You brought it back to life. You brought me back to life." He finally closed the space between them, taking her hands in his. They were cool, but they did not tremble. "I do not want you to be the steward of my estate. I want you to be its heart. I want you to be my partner in all things. I am asking you not to become a duchess, but to become my wife, to choose me, Alistair, the man you have saved from his own ghosts." Alara looked into his eyes, and she saw the truth of his words. She saw the man behind the title, the vulnerable, honorable man she had first glimpsed in the quiet of the library. Her acceptance, when it came, was as quiet and certain as every other action she had taken in that house. "I have been alone for a very long time, Alistair," she said, her voice clear and steady. "In many rooms, both large and small. They were all empty. This house was empty too. But it is not empty anymore." She squeezed his hands. "Yes, I will be your wife." It was an acceptance not of a title or a fortune, but of a partnership. It was a conscious act of trust, the final careful column in a ledger she had been balancing in her own heart. A year passed. The rain still fell on Blackwood Manor, but it no longer seemed to weep. It washed the stones clean and nourished the gardens, which were now a riot of color and life. The house was filled with light and warmth, its corridors echoing not with silence, but with the quiet sounds of a home that was loved and lived in. The dust sheets were gone, the chandelier in the main hall glittered, and the portraits of the ancestors seemed to smile with approval. In the west garden, Alara, now the Duchess of Blackwood, knelt in the rich earth, a trowel in her hand. She was discussing the placement of a new rose bush with her husband. Alistair was not overseeing her work. He was listening, his head inclined, his expression one of deep and abiding affection. He valued her opinion on roses as much as he valued it on crop rotation and investments. They were a team, their strengths intertwined, their partnership the bedrock on which the new life of the manor was built. Later, they stood in the library, the late afternoon sun slanting through the tall, clean windows, illuminating the rich bindings of the books. The room was their sanctuary, the place where their story had truly begun. He came to stand behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. She leaned into his embrace, a comfortable, familiar gesture that spoke of 1,000 such moments shared over the past year. He had given her the smallest room in the house to make her feel small. The thought returned to him, not with shame anymore, but with a sense of wonder. It had been an act of casual cruelty, born of neglect and his sister's malice, an attempt to contain her, to define her by her meager circumstances. But it had failed so completely, so beautifully. Her spirit had refused to be confined. Instead, her quiet, steady strength had expanded from that single, forgotten point, flowing out to fill every cold corridor, to warm every empty room, to mend the broken ledgers and the broken man who owned them. The attempt to make her small had only served to reveal the true, magnificent scale of her heart, a heart which was now and forever the home he had been searching for all along.